Hi everyone, and thanks for being here. What I'm going to talk about today is a work in progress about studying algorithmic accountability and for developing a qualitative framework for studying it. I come from a legal background, but I draw upon a lot of insights from the humanities, so I'm kind of interested to see what you guys will think of this. All right. In May 2019, around the world, drivers of ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft switched off their ride-sharing apps and refused to make their services available. Instead, they gathered on the streets in their vehicles and honked together in solidarity. They honked together to protest the abysmal working conditions in the ride-sharing industry. They honked together to speak up against the exploitation by so-called platform gig or sharing economy, which is enabled through the unaccountability of data-driven algorithmic practices. This is not the only instance of protest against algorithmic unaccountability. Protests against the deployment of algorithmic systems in distribution of welfare benefits in Netherlands, against the use of data-driven automated decision-making for the management of health data in UK, and even against the use of algorithms in the determination of property value in the real estate market, which is blamed for gentrification in places like San Francisco and Berlin, are all concrete examples of the assertion of unaccountability of algorithms. And these protests need to be seen as such. And at the same time, these protests point to questions of wider socioeconomic justice at stake in digital practices. Yet, when the algorithmic accountability idea is conceptually evoked, to what extent are these assertions of accountability, these protests, actually taken into account? A perusal of law and technology and ethics, algorithmic ethics literature in this area shows that discussions of algorithmic accountability are usually associated with one or more of the following broad concerns. Concerns of identity-based discrimination through algorithmic profiling or decision-making, as was also discussed in the last presentation, data protection and privacy protections in the deployment of algorithms, and third, adherence to rule of law, due process, and related transparency concerning the use of data-driven algorithms. Lying at the center of these concerns in algorithmic ethics and law and technology discourse is the human. Algorithmic accountability is sought for the human. Specifically, in the discourse on data-driven algorithms in European law, this human subject translates as the data subject, who is defined as an identified or identifiable natural person. This is the quote from the legal law. The construction of a legal framework of algorithmic accountability can be understood as a mapping exercise that calls for the protection of individual rights of this data subject who can be identified. So the question I struggle with in my work is, how does this individually defined data subject relate to the larger issues of socioeconomic injustices which are being asserted by populations who find themselves exploited by algorithmic practices? Can these issues of algorithmic mediated socioeconomic injustices be understood together with the individually oriented data subject or the human, which is a focus in algorithmic ethics, in law and technology discourse? And how to study the relationship between these seemingly quite different lines of inquiry, at least on the face of it. I find asking this question important because the separation of the law and technology discourse on algorithmic accountability from the grassroots protests that hold data-driven algorithmic practices as unjust and unaccountable points to an existence of differential relations of power. The power of law and technology discourse allows for a certain kind of knowledge production about algorithmic accountability. Mapping who and what is excluded from such knowledge production is essential to tracing the discursive exclusions. But it is not just discursive exclusions. Rather, given that law enforces its discourse through the use of force, Such countermapping is also essential to tracing the material exclusions and even the material oppressions enacted through such discourse on algorithmic accountability, algorithmic ethics, or law and technology discourse around the same. Algorithmic accountability needs to account for the politics of law as much as it does for the politics of algorithms, for the politics of regulation, as much as for the politics of data. However, such an approach to understanding algorithmic accountability also presents a methodological challenge. In the study of law and technology, the regulatory understanding of law dominates. Right. So what do I mean by the regulatory understanding of law? As per this understanding, law is seen as a mechanism to permit or prohibit certain practices of technology or to set norms and norms of behavior and of conduct around them. The relationship of the individual data subject to digital technologies like data-driven algorithms is largely woven through a narrative whereby new technology produces new effects for the life of the data subject, and the law's role is essentially to permit or prohibit such effects depending on whether they are identified as harmful or beneficial to the data subject. In this regulatory approach to law, algorithmic accountability is mapped as a maximization of the benefits and the minimization of the harms of data-driven algorithms for the human or the data subject which is at stake there. But what such regulatory approach to law fails to take into account is that law is not merely a permission prohibition regime, but rather it is also a practice of social ordering in the digital society. Law fulfills this ordering function through the creation of narratives that construct differential power relations between various socio-economic and technological practices. Such an understanding of law points to not merely its regulatory, but its productive function and the underlying politics of such production. In his work, Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault points to how juridical systems of power appear to regulate life in purely negative terms, in terms of permission or prohibition, in terms of saying this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do. But the subjects regulated by such structures are, by virtue of being subjected to them, formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with the requirements of those structures. However, this insight has not been adequately deployed in the studies of law, technology, and society. As social legal scholar Marianne Valvedre points out, law and society literature has appropriated Foucault's work on broad concepts like discipline, but has failed to come to terms with the challenge to basic epistemological framework for academic work that it presents. Nevertheless, voices of resistance on the streets often remind us of the failure to incorporate the so-called theoretical insight about the productive aspect of power. One aspect of such productive power of law is the generation of subjectivities like human or data subject, which I talked about earlier. A number of grassroots protests against socioeconomic injustices actually bring such subjectivities into question. Protesters against Siri, the big data analysis system put in place to detect unemployment fraud in Netherlands, ask, are those who seek state social welfare not human? Uber drivers around the world cry out, workers are human too. These voices speak against the understanding of human which is put to socioeconomic exploitation in digital society. So, if we center these oft marginalized voices of protest, and if we were to be accountable to their lives, and we must do this, we find that human or data subject whose interests lie at the heart of the algorithmic accountability discourse is actually quite a contested entity. The boundaries of such humanness are contested and therefore fluid, even as law attempts to solidify and determine it, or even as ethical paradigms for algorithmic governance aim to solidify these norms and determine them through the construction of the human or the data subject. How these boundaries are constructed, how they are set, becomes a political issue. It is an issue of who has the power to set the boundaries and to the exclusion of which experiences of life. A countermapping methodology accountable to marginalized lives in the digital society, which speak up against its socioeconomic injustices, then needs to acknowledge the constructed nature of human in the algorithmic accountability discourse instead of taking it for granted. Concretely, what would such acknowledgement mean in the study of law, society, and digital technologies? What would methodology look like? Well, it would imply a shift from mapping algorithmic accountability through the lens of naturalized subjectivities, example through the category of human or technology or algorithms, towards deconstructing these very categories in order to reveal the contestations, the power relations, and related unaccountability underlying them. Such deconstruction may be attempted through what science studies scholar Karen Barrett, using the work of anthropologist Lila Fernandez, calls the rejection of representationalism. Very briefly, representationalism for Barrett means, I quote, the belief in ontological distinction between representations and that which they purport to represent. In particular, that which is represented is held to be independent of all practices of representing. That is, these are assumed to be two distinct and independent kinds of entities, representations and the entities to be represented. Well, the crisis of representation is nothing new, especially for this crowd. So moving on, I want to talk a bit about how this representation is, how it still persists quite a bit in law, technology, and ethical discourses around algorithmic accountability, because it's very much embedded in such regulatory discourse insofar as the data subject that it claims to represent and the human whose interests it claims to protect are seen as natural and apolitical categories. Technology needs to be human-centric, not very clear what or who this human is, how this human has appeared in the discourse. And it's seen as natural and apolitical as opposed to being constructed through the very, as opposed to being seen as constructed through the very act of this representation. The fixation of algorithmic accountability discourse then within such representationalism means that we barely question the category of human which algorithms are to be made to be accountable for. As the work of Lila Fernandez shows, the shift away from such representationalism which would require paying attention to the linguistic and material practices that occur to define the boundaries of the category of the human, and conversely of technology, economy, society, and law. Which brings me to my next point, which is that this is hardly a new idea. Feminist and post-colonial scholars of law, science, and technology have critiqued the naturalization of identity categories and the unaccountability created through such naturalization. Kavita Philip deconstructs the naturalized figure of the racialized laborer on scientifically mediated colonial plantations. Lily Irani pokes holes in the naturalized construction of the entrepreneurial citizen of the digital society, and Ruha Benjamin deconstructs the seemingly natural construction of gender and race in relation to genetic and surveillance technologies. These are just a few scattered examples in order to map algorithmic accountability for voices demanding social justice in the digital society. We need to pay close attention to these rich bodies of literature created by people of color and therefore still marginalized. But oh well, eugenics is also in fashion these days. We need the insights, however, in order to focus on the politics of the practices in digital society, either regulatory, social, or technological, and ideally together, which instill the boundaries of human interacting with technology instead of merely focusing on the harms and benefits of technology to a predefined category of a human. Such countermapping of algorithmic accountability demands a shift from asking It demands a shift from asking are algorithms accountable for the rights and interests of the data subject or the human in the digital economy, which is the question which seems to be predominantly something we are asking right now, to asking is the socio-legal technological construction of the human and data subject accountable to the experiences of marginalization in digital societies. And in this way, it also plugs in to the keynote earlier today to think about how these universalized constructs of human are also generated in the discourse of algorithmic accountability, and are they responding to the lives of actual people who are living out there, and then which people? Well, that's all for today. Thank you.